You're listening to today's inspirational message on the book of Titus with Brady Randall.
This is Kurt Bjorklund. Welcome to 5 Good Minutes. Today we're going to be considering Titus 1, and we're going to get to hear from Brady Randall. Brady serves as our campus pastor at our Butler campus and is part of just our great staff here at Orchard Hill. So enjoy today's teaching.
Well, the remainder of this chapter talks about false teachers and those who are insubordinate and resistant to authority. And I wonder if you've ever worked with someone who is trying to upset the apple cart. And this could be on a team or just working against the mission of the overall organization in your job, or even as a student if you look back that far. Or maybe you're a current student. And Paul encounters such people. Here's what we read in verse 10. For there are many rebellious people, full of meaningless talk and deception, especially those of the circumcision group. Now, anyone who's ever been a part of leadership or on a work team or a sports team has undoubtedly encountered these kinds of people who are working against the mission. And while it's uncomfortable and difficult to confront such people, it's even more deadly to do nothing about it. What made it especially difficult for Titus was that there were many rebellious people, we read. It's hard enough when there's one or two, but let alone many. That's why it remains, and it still remains all the more important, to have good and qualified and godly leadership in place to deal with people in situations like this. Much of this was coming from what's called the circumcision group. And the circumcision group were the Jewish people who taught that you basically had to do the physical cutting or circumcision in order to become a believer, and as well as adhere to much of the Old Testament ceremonies. And what was particularly insidious about this group was that it was teaching that this sort of works-based righteousness or salvation. And it was putting up more and more barriers than necessary in order for people to have to first follow Jesus. And Paul says very strongly in verse 11 that they must be silenced, because not only are they teaching contrary to the gospel, but they're upsetting and disrupting the whole households. And they're doing it for dishonest financial gain. They're motivated by greed. And as a people person myself, I don't like confrontation. I don't like not to be well thought of. I don't like to be disliked. I don't like to cause consternation and upset the peace. But I also know, and I've learned from experience, that not addressing it is much, much worse. Oftentimes in the current situation, but certainly in the future. And it reminds me of the weeds that I've encountered at my house this past spring. I have shrubbery in both the front and back of my house. And this spring, I began to see some weeds sprouting up in both places. And the front bothered me particularly because I rolled into my garage and I saw it every time. The back, I could, take or leave it. I could see it, but it wasn't as big a deal. Because when I saw it, what I would do is I just pull it out very quickly in the driveway because I didn't like the sight of it. But I also got lazy when it came to some of the weeds. And instead of literally dealing with the root of the weeds of the problem, I would quickly just pull out the weeds, trying to get the root where I could, but pulling out very quickly the green part where I couldn't. And in the back, where I had weeds growing through the lattice, my wooden lattice, I didn't like the sight of it, so I just quickly pulled them out, all that I could see. Well, quickly my plan failed. As we got more and more rain in the spring, the weed problem got worse and worse. The weeds came up where I didn't deal with the roots. My shrubs became overgrown. And in the back, where I gave the least amount of attention, I had weeds growing like never before because I literally didn't deal with the roots of the main problems. And I would have saved myself so much time and effort and so much more stress. And my house would have looked a lot better this summer if I had only taken more time to get at the roots and spray some weed killer. I learned an important lesson with weeds that all of us could apply as it deals with dealing with toxic people, especially people trying to subvert the mission of the church and the false teachers. So Paul then uses a helpful literary technique for this argument by quoting a Cretan author, and he agrees with him. And Crete was known in the ancient world for its moral and bad reputation. Here's verse 12 and 14. One of Crete's own prophets has said this: Cretans are always liars, evil brutes, lazy gluttons. This saying is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply. so that they will be sound in the faith and pay no attention to Jewish myths or to merely human commands or those who reject the truth. If you don't consider their character and insidious teaching, it will come back to bite you. But not only that, it can spoil the whole church. Most things rise and fall under leadership. And leadership and leaders' character are so important, especially in the church. Author and speaker Carey Nieuwhof encourages leaders to work twice as hard on your character as you do in your competency. I believe that's why God counters alternatively in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 7, where God says this, "Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you and consider the outcome of their way of life and imitate their faith." Rooting out false teaching and doctrine is so important because just a little bit of contamination in teaching can corrupt entire families and churches. Ultimately, the health and mission of the church depends on such swift and important initiatives. Therefore, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, I invite you to pray today for the leadership of your local church and pray how God might use you as an encouragement in this way. Pray also for any difficult conversations that God might be calling you to have even this very week.
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.